Go to the old barn. Don't tell your sister. Those were the last words my husband ever wrote to me, and I did not read them until 3 years after we buried him. I remember standing in the doorway of that barn on a gray Tuesday in October, my hand shaking so hard I could barely hold the flashlight the lawyer's courier had pressed into my palm, along with a sealed envelope. The barn smelled the way it always had. Apples gone soft in their crates, old motor oil, and cedar dust drifting down from the rafters like snow that never quite reached the floor. I hadn't been inside that building since the funeral. Robert built half of it himself, back when we were young enough to believe we had all the time in the world. The letter told me exactly where to look. Behind the third support beam, beneath a floorboard he'd marked with a small brass tack, there was a metal lockbox wrapped twice in oilcloth to keep out the damp. My name was written across the top of it in his handwriting, the same steady hand that used to sign our anniversary cards. 3 years. He had been gone 3 years, and somehow he had reached across all that silence to put a box in my hands at the exact moment I needed it most. I want to tell you what was inside that box. I will, I promise you that. But first you need to understand what I was walking away from that morning, and why a dying man would trust a barn over his own family. My name is Eleanor Whitfield. I am 61 years old, and for 38 of those years I was married to a man named Robert, a man everyone in our little corner of Vermont called Bob, a man who built an apple orchard out of 40 acres of rocky hillside and his own 2 stubborn hands. When he died, I lost the only person who had ever looked at me like I was the most competent woman in any room I walked into. And in the vacuum he left behind, my own sister walked in and started measuring the curtains. If you've ever had to stand your ground against someone who swore up and down that they loved you, someone who used that word, family, like a leash instead of a promise, I want you to tell me where you're watching this from tonight. Because I have a feeling a lot of you already know exactly what I'm talking about. 3 years before that morning in the barn, I sat in a folding chair in a hospice room holding Robert's hand while a machine counted out his last hours in soft electronic beeps. My sister Carol sat in the chair across from me, dabbing at dry eyes with a tissue she never actually used, already, even then, talking about what we'll need to figure out. I didn't hear the warning in that sentence. I was too busy losing my husband to notice I was about to lose control of my own life. Carol is 4 years younger than me, and for most of our childhood, I loved her the way you love someone you've been told to protect. Our mother used to say Carol was the delicate one, and I was the capable one, which sounds like a compliment until you realize what it actually means. It means one daughter gets held, and the other daughter gets handed the checkbook. I didn't resent it then. I resented it later, when I understood what capable had cost me. Robert used to tease me, gently, about how I let Carol get away with things. Money borrowed and never repaid. Promises made at Thanksgiving and forgotten by New Year's. One of these days, he told me once, not long after we married, standing in this very barn oiling a tractor part, that woman is going to ask you for something you can't give back. I laughed it off. I told him Carol just needed a little more time to find her footing than the rest of us. Robert didn't laugh with me. He just kept working the oil into the metal, quiet in that way he got when he'd decided not to argue with me, but hadn't changed his mind either. The orchard was Robert's grandfather's land first, 42 acres of macoun and honeycrisp trees, running up the shoulder of a hill outside a town so small it doesn't have its own zip code exchange, just borrows the one from the county seat 11 miles down the road. 3 generations of Whitfields had pressed cider in that barn, sold bushels out of a roadside stand every September, and buried their dead in the little cemetery behind the tree line where the frost always came first. When Robert proposed to me, he didn't do it with a ring first. He walked me up to the top of the hill, pointed down at 4 decades of orchard rows, and said, "This is what I have to offer you. It isn't much, but it's mine, and I want it to be ours." I said yes before he finished the sentence. We built a life on that hill. We raised our daughter, Sarah, in the farmhouse at the bottom of the drive, and I want you to understand something about Sarah before I go any further, because she matters to everything that comes after. Sarah moved to Denver 11 years ago for her husband's job, and she calls every Sunday like clockwork, and she loves this orchard the way you love a childhood photograph, fondly, from a distance, without the calluses that come from actually working the land. That distance is going to matter. Carol used it like a tool, but the person who kept me tethered to my own strength during those first unbearable months of grief wasn't Sarah. It was my granddaughter, Lily, 12 years old, who flew out from Denver every summer to spend 6 weeks climbing those apple trees the same way her mother had, the same way I had taught her father-in-law's family to for 2 generations before her. Lily used to sit on the porch steps beside me shelling peas and say things a 12-year-old has no business understanding, like, "Grandma, you're allowed to be sad and strong at the same time, you know. Mom says you don't have to pick." I have thought about that sentence more times than I can count in the 3 years since. I tell you about Lily now because she is the reason any of what follows matters. Everything I did, every quiet, careful, deliberate thing, I did because somewhere in the back of my mind I kept picturing her climbing those same trees when she was 20 and 30, and bringing her own children up that hill to stand where her great-grandfather once stood. Carol never once, not a single time in 3 years, mentioned Lily's name when she talked about the future of that land. That should have told me everything. It didn't, not at first. Grief has a way of making you slow to see the obvious. Robert died on the 14th of April, a Tuesday, at 4:52 in the afternoon, with rain coming down sideways against the hospice window. I remember the exact time because I have looked at that clock face in my memory more times than I can count, the way you replay the last frame of a film hoping the ending might change if you watch closely enough. It never does. He was gone, and the barn stood empty on the hill, and the trees kept blooming whether we asked them to or not. Carol moved into the farmhouse guest room 4 days after the funeral. She told me it was temporary, just until I got my feet under me. She told me this while unpacking 3 suitcases into the closet across from the room where my husband's clothes still hung, untouched, still smelling faintly of cedar and diesel and him. I remember thinking, even then, in the fog of that first week, that 3 suitcases seemed like a great deal of luggage for a temporary stay. I said nothing. I was too tired to say anything. That tiredness, I would come to learn, was exactly what Carol had been counting on. By the end of that first month, Carol had rearranged my kitchen, hired a lawyer named Grant Pierce to help settle the estate, and gently suggested, over coffee one gray morning, that I sign a power of attorney, just so somebody competent can handle the boring parts while you grieve. I want you to notice that word, competent. My own sister used it the way my mother once had, as a compliment with a blade folded inside it. I signed the paper. God help me, I signed it without reading past the first paragraph, because my husband's ashes were still in a box on the mantel, and I did not have the strength left in my body to argue about paperwork. That signature is the hinge this entire story turns on. Everything that came after, every slow theft, every cruel word, every scheme Carol built in the years that followed, all of it depended on that one tired, grieving signature. I want to tell you I regret it. I don't. Not entirely. Because if I hadn't signed it, I never would have learned exactly how far my sister was willing to go. And I never would have understood exactly why my husband left me a package in a barn with instructions not to breathe a word to her. The first year, Carol was careful. She paid the property taxes on time and made a show of showing me the receipts, building trust the way a con artist builds trust, in small, honest increments designed to earn a much larger, dishonest withdrawal later. She started calling the orchard our project, then the family investment, then, by the 18-month mark, simply the asset, a word Robert never once used in 38 years of loving that land. Words matter. I know that now. I wish I had understood it then. It was somewhere in that second year that the comments started. Small at first, delivered with a smile, so I couldn't quite call them cruel out loud. You don't need to understand the details, Ellie. You just need to sign where Grant marks the tab. She said some version of that sentence to me at least a dozen times, always in that same sweet, patient voice. The voice you'd use on a child or a dog you were fond of, but didn't fully trust to sit still. I want you to remember that phrase, because it comes back later, and when it does, I promise you it lands differently the second time. Walt Higgins had worked our orchard for 30 years by the time Robert died, first as a hired hand at 19, then as foreman by 30, and by the time I'm telling you this story, as close to family as any man who doesn't share our blood could possibly be. Walt watched Carol move into that farmhouse with a foreman's quiet, careful eyes. The same eyes he used to spot a diseased branch 3 trees deep in a row before anybody else noticed the leaves turning wrong. He didn't say much to me at first. Walt has never been a man who speaks before he's certain. But he started keeping his own records that second year, quietly, in a composition notebook he kept locked in the equipment shed. Dates and numbers and observations nobody had asked him to write down. I didn't know about that notebook yet, standing in the barn that October morning with the lockbox in my hands. I only knew that my husband, a man who had been dead for 3 years, had somehow reached forward through all that silence to tell me exactly where to look and exactly who not to tell. I knelt down on that dusty floor, my knees protesting the cold, and I opened the box. Inside, on top of everything else, was a single folded letter in Robert's handwriting, and beneath it, wrapped in a soft cloth, a stack of documents thick enough to need a rubber band to hold them closed. I unfolded the letter first. My hands were shaking so badly the paper rattled like a leaf in wind, and the first line hit me before I even had time to brace myself for it. "My dearest Ellie," it read, "if you are reading this, it means 3 years have passed, and I am about to ask you to forgive me for something I never told you while I was alive." I sat back on my heels in that cold barn, and I read that sentence 4 times before I could make myself keep going, because in 38 years of marriage, Robert Whitfield had never once used the word forgive with me. Not once. And I had absolutely no idea, not the slightest inkling, what a dying man could possibly think he needed forgiveness for. If you're the kind of person who's ever had to sit alone with a piece of paper that changed everything you thought you understood about your own life, you already know the particular kind of silence that falls over a room in that moment. It isn't peaceful. It's the silence right before a held breath finally breaks. I kept reading. Robert wrote that he had suspected, for the better part of a decade, that Carol had a habit that ran deeper than borrowed money and broken promises. He wrote about our mother's final years, about a period near the end when our mother's modest retirement savings, nearly $60,000 set aside over a working lifetime, had drained down to almost nothing under Carol's management as the appointed caretaker, and how our mother, in her confusion near the end, had never been able to explain where it went, and how Carol had explained it away to the rest of the family as medical costs nobody wants to itemize in front of Mama. I remembered that period. I remembered believing her. Robert wrote that he had never told me because he didn't have proof, only instinct, and because he knew how much I loved my sister despite everything, and because, in his words, a man doesn't get to destroy his wife's family with a suspicion he can't prove. But he had watched Carol circle closer to us after his diagnosis, watched her sudden interest in the orchard's finances, watched the way she started asking Grant Pierce questions about property value before Robert had even finished his first round of chemotherapy. So he did something about it. Quietly. The way he did everything. He had gone, in the last 8 months of his life, to a different attorney entirely. A woman named Renata Cole, 2 counties over. Someone with no connection to Carol or to Grant Pierce. And together they had filed a restrictive covenant on the orchard's deed at the county recorder's office. A legal restriction requiring Eleanor Whitfield's sole, notarized, in-person signature before any transfer, sale, or encumbrance of the property could proceed, regardless of any power of attorney executed before or after. He had built a wall around our home that no signature obtained under grief or pressure could ever knock down. He had done it without telling me, because, he wrote, if you knew it existed, some part of you would relax, and I need you to stay sharp until the day you actually need it. I sat in that barn and I laughed and cried at the same time, a sound I'm not sure I'd ever made before in my life. My husband had built me a trapdoor 3 years before I knew I was standing over a pit. But the deed restriction wasn't the only thing in that box, and it wasn't, I would come to learn over the following weeks, even the most important thing. Underneath the letter, beneath a second cloth wrapping, was a thick manila folder labeled in Robert's block capitals, Evidence, for when she tries. I want you to sit with that phrase for a moment, the same way I had to. Not if she tries, when she tries. My husband had died certain, absolutely certain, that his sister-in-law would eventually come for everything we had built, and he had spent the final months of his life quietly assembling a case against a woman who, at that point, hadn't yet done a single provably wrong thing. It felt, reading it, like being handed a loaded gun by a ghost and told the war hadn't started yet. It had only been delayed. I need to tell you what was in that folder because it matters to everything that happened next. But I also need you to understand the timing, because timing is the entire reason this story unfolds the way it does. That morning in the barn wasn't a random Tuesday. It was 6 days before Carol's closing date. 6 days before she planned to sell 42 acres of my husband's family legacy to a development company for $1.8 million. Without my knowledge, without my signature, and, as I would soon discover, entirely without my consent ever having been legally possible in the first place. I sat with that number for a long time after I finished reading. $1.8 million. Turning it over the way you turn over a stone to see what's living underneath it. It wasn't the size of the figure that frightened me, though God knows it was enough money to make my knees go weak on that cold barn floor. It was the casualness of it, the way Carol had apparently discussed 42 acres of my husband's grandfather's life work the same way you'd discuss selling off a used car, a transaction to be processed and closed and forgotten. I folded Robert's letter back along its original creases, careful not to tear the paper where 3 years of being carried inside that oilcloth had already worn it thin. And I sat there a while longer in the cold, just breathing. The barn was quiet in the particular way empty buildings are quiet, full of small sounds that only become audible once you stop expecting conversation. A loose sheet of tin somewhere up in the rafters ticked gently against a nail every time the wind found it. A field mouse rustled through last year's straw in the far corner, utterly indifferent to the fact that the woman kneeling on the floorboards nearby had just had her entire understanding of the last 3 years quietly rearranged. I remember thinking, absurdly, that Robert would have known exactly which nail that tin sheet needed, and that I did not, and that somehow, impossibly, I was going to have to learn. I did not open the manila folder that day, I want to be honest with you about that because I think it says something true about how grief and courage actually work together, which is to say, they rarely arrive on the same schedule. I had enough for one morning. I had a dead man's handwriting, a wound reopened, and a 6-day clock now ticking somewhere behind my ribs, and some instinct, some old animal sense of self-preservation, told me that if I opened that folder too, right there on the cold floor with my knees already aching and my hands already unsteady, I would not have anything left in me to drive myself home. So I wrapped the letter and the folder and the recorder back into the oilcloth exactly the way I had found them, the way Robert must have wrapped them himself, alone in this barn, already sick, already running out of time, thinking only of a morning 3 years in the future that he would never see. I latched the lockbox closed, and then I did something I hadn't done in 3 years, not once, not even at the funeral. I pressed my palm flat against that third support beam, the wood cool and rough under my hand, and I said his name out loud into the empty barn, just once, quietly, the way you'd greet someone you hadn't seen in a very long time. Nothing answered back, of course. I don't believe the dead speak to us in barns, not literally, but I will tell you that something in my chest loosened just slightly, the way a knot loosens when you finally stop pulling against it, and I stood up off that floor a different woman than the one who had knelt down on it 40 minutes earlier. I carried the lockbox back down the hill myself, tucked inside an old canvas feed sack so it wouldn't draw attention if Carol happened to glance out the kitchen window, which, I was learning to notice now, she often did. The walk down from the barn to the farmhouse takes about 6 minutes at a normal pace, past the first 3 rows of Honeycrisp trees Robert planted the year Sarah was born, past the old stone wall his grandfather built by hand before there was ever a tractor on this property to do the work for him, past the little rise where Lily liked to sit and watch for deer at dusk. I walked slowly. I wanted, I think, to feel every foot of that ground under my boots one more time, as though I might still lose it, because until 6 days from then, in the strictest legal sense that Renata Cole would later spell out for me in far greater detail, I still could have. I let myself in through the mudroom door rather than the front, and I carried that feed sack straight up the back stairs to the bedroom closet I still, after 3 years, thought of as mine and Robert's rather than simply mine, and I slid the lockbox onto the high shelf behind a stack of quilts my mother-in-law had made before I ever knew this family existed. My hands were shaking again by the time I closed that closet door, not from fear exactly, or not only from fear. Some of it, I think, was the strange, vertiginous feeling of suddenly understanding that the last 3 years of my life had not happened the way I believed they had happened, that there had been a second, hidden story running underneath the one I thought I was living, the entire time. I want to pause here and tell you something about grief that nobody had ever explained to me before that October morning, something I only understood once I had a folder full of evidence sitting on a shelf behind my mother-in-law's quilts. Grief does not just take away the person you loved, it takes away your confidence in your own perception, your trust in your own read of a room, a face, a sentence. For 3 years I had told myself, over and over, in the small hours when the doubt crept in, that I was simply too tired, too sad, too diminished by loss to trust my own unease about my sister. I had used my grief against myself, quietly, the same way Carol had used it against me loudly, and it had taken a dead man's handwriting to hand me back the one thing widowhood had quietly stolen without my ever noticing it was gone. Permission to believe what I had seen with my own eyes all along. Sarah called that afternoon, right on schedule, our Sunday call having slipped a day later than usual because of some scheduling mix-up with Lily's school pickup, and I remember standing in the kitchen with the phone pressed to my ear, my voice pitched carefully normal, describing the weather and asking about her husband's new job, and saying absolutely nothing about a lockbox now resting behind a stack of quilts 11 feet above where I stood. "You sound tired, Mom," Sarah said, the way she always said it, gently, without any real suspicion behind it. "Are you sure Aunt Carol isn't running you ragged with all this closing business?" I told her I was fine. I told her Carol had everything well in hand. Both of those sentences were, by that point, technically true and entirely misleading, and I understood, hanging up the phone 20 minutes later, that I had just told my own daughter the first calculated half-truth of what I now think of as my quiet war. It did not sit easily with me, that half-truth, and I want you to understand that discomfort rather than skip past it, because I think it matters to the kind of woman I was trying to become in those 6 days. I have never, in 61 years, been someone who enjoyed keeping things from the people I love. Robert used to say I had the worst poker face of anyone he'd ever met, that he always knew within about 4 seconds whether I'd had a good day or a bad one, just from the set of my shoulders in the doorway. Learning to hold a secret, a real one, with real weight behind it, felt at first like learning to walk on a broken ankle. Every step hurt. Every step, I did it anyway. Because I had made a promise to a dead man in a cold barn, and because some part of me, growing stronger by the hour, understood that this particular secret was the only thing standing between my granddaughter's inheritance and a stranger's development company sign staked into the hillside where Robert's grandfather was buried. I thought, more than once that first day, about simply confronting Carol outright, laying Robert's letter on the kitchen table between us, and demanding an explanation before she had any chance to prepare one. I want to tell you honestly why I didn't. It wasn't fear, not entirely, though there was some of that too. It was arithmetic. Renata Cole would later explain to me, in words far more precise than mine, that the moment Carol understood I knew, every piece of evidence Robert had spent his final months assembling would become a moving target instead of a fixed one. Accounts could be closed, records could be altered, or, worse, destroyed outright. A forger skilled enough to fake my signature once might, given 6 days' warning, be skilled enough to manufacture an explanation for all of it. Silence in those 6 days was not weakness. Silence was the only strategy that kept every piece of Robert's evidence exactly where it needed to be until I was ready to use it. So I made myself a cup of tea I had no intention of finishing, and I carried it to the kitchen table, and I sat there in the fading afternoon light while my sister moved around that same kitchen humming under her breath, pulling glossy catering brochures out of a tote bag, entirely unaware that the woman across from her now understood, with absolute clinical clarity, every single thing she had done. I remember the specific brochure she set in front of me, a company called Hillside Harvest Catering, offering what they called a rustic autumn package for exactly $3,850. Cider service and apple donuts and string lighting included. All of it billed, I would later confirm through Renata, directly against my own farm operating account without my knowledge or approval. "I was thinking the string lights should go along the main beams," Carol said, sliding the brochure across the table toward me with one manicured finger, entirely pleased with herself. "It'll photograph beautifully for Larkspur's marketing team. Preston Marsh said their buyers respond well to atmosphere, apparently. You don't need to worry about any of this, Ellie. I've got it completely under control." I looked at my sister's face, open and warm and utterly without guilt, and I understood in that instant something I would carry with me through everything that followed. That the most dangerous people in our lives are rarely the ones who look dangerous while they're doing it. "That sounds lovely, Carol," I said, and my voice came out steady, pleasant, exactly the voice she expected, the voice of the sister who signs where she's told to sign. Inside my chest, something colder and clearer than anything I had felt in 3 years was quietly counting down 6 days. She had no idea. Standing in that farmhouse kitchen that same evening, humming to herself while she reviewed catering menus for what she was calling the autumn preview, a public open house for the buyers and half the town, my sister had absolutely no idea that 3 years earlier, her own brother-in-law had already beaten her at a game she didn't yet know she was playing. She had no idea. Standing in that farmhouse kitchen that same evening, humming to herself while she reviewed catering menus for what she was calling the autumn preview, a public open house for the buyers and half the town, my sister had absolutely no idea that 3 years earlier, her own brother-in-law had already beaten her at a game she didn't yet know she was playing. I made myself a cup of tea. I sat at that kitchen table across from her, and for the first time in 3 years, I said nothing about what I was carrying. Because Robert had asked me for exactly one thing, and I intended to honor it completely. Don't tell your sister. Not yet. She had no idea what was coming. And by God, neither at that point did I. Not fully. Because the letter in that box had one more line at the very bottom, underlined twice in Robert's careful hand, that I hadn't let myself absorb yet. A line that would send me 3 days later into a bank vault 40 minutes away with a key I didn't even know I possessed. To understand exactly how we arrived at that kitchen table, at that catering menu, at that quiet, terrible calm, I need to take you back to the beginning of the wound. Back before the letters and the deed restrictions and the folders labeled in block capitals. Back to the woman I used to be, before I learned what my own sister was capable of. I was not always careful. I want to be honest about that, because I think it's the only way any of this makes sense. For the first year after Robert died, I was a woman drowning in the specific, unglamorous exhaustion of grief. The kind that makes you forget to eat, forget to answer the phone, forget that the world is still asking things of you even when you have nothing left to give it. Carol arrived into that exhaustion like a hand reaching down into water, and for a long time, I genuinely believed she was pulling me up rather than pulling me under. She handled the funeral arrangements with an efficiency that felt, at the time, like a gift. She fielded calls from Robert's old business contacts, wrote thank you cards to the dozens of people who sent flowers, and sat with me on the nights the silence in that farmhouse got loud enough to hurt. I loved her for it. I want that on the record too, because I don't want you to think this is a story about a woman who was simply cruel from the start. Carol was, for a while, genuinely useful, genuinely present, and I have spent 3 years trying to untangle how much of that early kindness was real and how much of it was groundwork. I still don't fully know the answer. I've made a kind of peace with not knowing. What I do know is when the shift happened. It was the day Grant Pierce first sat at our kitchen table, 4 months after the funeral, a slim leather folio open in front of him, explaining in a warm, unhurried voice that, in situations like this, it's simply prudent for someone with a clear head to hold the financial reins while Eleanor focuses on healing. Nobody asked me if I wanted someone else holding my reins. Carol had already decided, and Grant had already been retained, and the folio was already open to the page with a signature line at the bottom. I signed it. I've told you that already. But I want you to understand the specific mechanics of what that signature did, because it matters. It granted Carol, as my attorney in fact, authority over the farmhouse's operating accounts, the orchard's business accounts, and, critically, though none of us said this part out loud at the table, authority to negotiate on my behalf regarding any offers made for the sale of real property, pending my final approval. A phrase that sounds protective until you realize how easily a tired, grieving woman's final approval can be obtained with the right combination of patience and pressure. Within 6 months, the operating account that funded Walt's salary, the equipment maintenance, and the seasonal harvest labor had developed what Carol called seasonal fluctuations, a phrase she used so often it started to sound like a weather pattern instead of a description of missing money. I asked about it exactly once. She told me farm accounting was complicated, that Robert had always handled it and I'd simply never had reason to understand the rhythms of it, and that I should trust her the way I'd trusted him. I did. God forgive me, I did. It was Walt who first said something out loud, standing in the equipment shed on a cold February afternoon, snow banked up against the corrugated metal walls, his breath fogging in front of him as he spoke. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said. And I remember he'd never called me that before, always just Eleanor, and the formality of it should have warned me something serious was coming. "I don't like getting into family business, but the fertilizer order didn't clear last month, and the account your sister set up for the farm operations, it's not the same account Bob and I used for 30 years. There's a new one. I only found out because the co-op called me directly asking where their payment went." I told Walt I was sure there was an explanation. He looked at me the way you look at someone you respect too much to argue with directly, and he said, quietly, "There probably is, ma'am. I just think you ought to be the one who hears it, not me." That was Walt's way of planting a seed he knew I wasn't ready to water yet. It would take me another 18 months to be ready. Walt, bless him, was patient enough to wait. I did not water that seed for a long while, but I want you to understand that it did not simply lie dormant either. Something in me had shifted after that conversation in the equipment shed, some small, stubborn seed of doubt that refused to fully close back over the way it had every other time Carol offered me an easy explanation. I started, without quite admitting it to myself, keeping my own eyes open a little wider. I did not confront anyone. I did not ask pointed questions. I simply watched, the way you watch weather rolling in from a distance, uncertain yet whether it will pass you by or break directly overhead. The 1-year mark of Robert's death fell on a Tuesday, and I remember it distinctly because Carol organized what she called a remembrance lunch at the farmhouse, inviting nearly 30 people, most of whom I hadn't spoken to in months, filling my dining room with casserole dishes and sympathy cards a full year after anyone else in town had stopped sending them. I appreciated the gesture, or told myself I did, though some part of me wondered, quietly, why my grief needed an audience quite that large to be properly honored. Carol stood at the head of the table that day, in a black dress far more elegant than anything I owned, and gave a short speech about Robert that managed, somehow, to mention her own sacrifices twice for every single time she mentioned his name. It was at that same lunch that I first heard her use the phrase, long-term plans for the property, dropped so casually into a conversation with Dwayne Fletcher from the co-op that I nearly missed it entirely, buried as it was between a comment about the weather and a request for more coffee. "Once we sort out what makes sense long-term for the property," she said, "we'll have a much clearer picture of where everyone stands." Dwayne nodded along amiably, the way you nod at a sentence that sounds reasonable enough not to question, and the conversation moved on to something else entirely before I had even finished processing the word "we." I asked her about it later that evening, once the last casserole dish had been washed and returned to whichever neighbor had sent it. She told me I was reading far too much into small talk, that Dwayne always asked about the orchard's future and she was simply being polite. I believed her. I want you to notice, again, how easily I believed her, and how carefully she had built a version of herself I had no real reason yet to distrust. Sarah, out in Denver, was receiving an entirely different version of that same year, filtered gently and consistently through Carol's careful narration during the phone calls the two of them had started having independent of mine. Calls I only learned about much later, after everything had already come apart. Carol called her at least twice a month that first year, always with some small update about how Mom's really doing, always framing herself as the exhausted, selfless sister holding together a family that would otherwise be adrift. Sarah, 1,000 miles away with a young daughter and a husband settling into a demanding new job, had no reason in the world to question any of it. Why would she? Her aunt called with updates nobody had asked her to provide, painting herself as devoted. And her mother, on our own Sunday calls, sounded tired and vague and grateful for the help, because I was tired and I was vague, and at the time, I genuinely was grateful. It took me a long time to understand what that double narration actually accomplished. Carol was not simply managing me. She was managing the story of me, told to the one person whose opinion could have most easily unraveled everything, my own daughter. Carefully enough and early enough that by the time any real doubt crept in, 3 years of consistent narrative had already hardened into something that felt, even to Sarah, like established fact. "Isn't it lucky Aunt Carol's there?" she used to say to me, and I understand now that sentence was not naivety on Sarah's part. It was the finished product of a story someone else had been writing for 2 years before Sarah ever had reason to ask a single skeptical question about it. Barbara Doone, my old friend from the county school, tried once more that spring to say something more directly than her earlier gentle warning at the church supper. We were sitting on my porch, the same porch where Lily would sit shelling peas a year later, and Barbara set down her coffee cup with a particular deliberateness that told me she'd been building up to this for a while. "Ellie," she said, "I ran into Grant Pierce's secretary at the pharmacy last week. She mentioned offhand that your sister comes into that office more than any client she's ever seen who isn't actually paying the bill herself. I don't know what that means. I just thought you should know, somebody's noticing." I told Barbara I trusted Carol completely, and I remember the specific expression that crossed her face when I said it. Not disbelief exactly, but the particular patient sadness of a friend who can see a wall going up in real time and knows there is nothing she can do to stop the bricklaying. I want to be honest about something here because I think it matters more than almost any other detail in this part of the story. I was not simply naive during that first year, and I do not want you to imagine me as a foolish woman incapable of reading warning signs. I was grieving in a way that consumed every available resource I had for suspicion, for confrontation, for the kind of hard, unpleasant conversations that real doubt requires. Grief is not stupidity, but grief creates a very particular kind of exhaustion, one that makes the path of least resistance, believing the person who is telling you not to worry, feel indistinguishable from wisdom. Carol understood that exhaustion better than anyone else in my life, including, I think, herself. She did not necessarily set out from day one with a master plan carved in stone. I believe, having sat with all of this for 3 years now, that she simply recognized an opportunity early, tested its edges cautiously, and found, again and again, that the edges gave way exactly as far as she pushed them. Walt's notebook, the one that would eventually sit bound and photocopied in Renata's leather folder, grew steadily fuller that year, though I did not know it at the time. He logged, in his careful block handwriting, every discrepancy he noticed in the farm's supply orders, every unfamiliar name that appeared on an invoice, every conversation with the co-op or the equipment supplier that raised even the smallest question in his mind. He never brought any of it to me directly again after that first February conversation, having understood, correctly, that I wasn't yet ready to hear it. But he kept writing. I think, looking back, Walt understood something about patience that I would not fully learn myself until I stood in that barn 3 years later, reading my husband's letter. Some truths cannot be forced on a person before they're ready to receive them. The kindest thing you can sometimes do for someone you love is simply keep the record accurate and wait for the day they finally ask to see it. By the late spring of that first year, the operating account irregularities Walt had first noticed had settled into what I now understand was a deliberate, sustainable rhythm. Small enough month to month that no single withdrawal looked alarming on its own, consistent enough over time to add up to real money. Priya Anand's later forensic report would put a precise figure on that first year alone: $18,400 diverted through what Carol and Grant were already calling, on that recording I would not hear for 2 more years, the holding company, though the entity itself, Cascade Ridge Partners, would not be formally registered for another several months yet. I knew none of these numbers at the time. I only knew that grocery money felt tighter than it should have, that Walt's face had a new tightness to it some mornings, that the farmhouse, for reasons I could not name, felt smaller and colder than it had before, despite nothing about its physical dimensions having changed at all. It was that same spring that I first noticed Carol beginning to speak about me, in small ways in the third person, even when I was standing directly in the room. "Ellie doesn't really need to worry about that," she'd say to Grant, or to a neighbor, or to one of the book club women, gesturing vaguely in my direction as though I were a piece of furniture whose comfort mattered, but whose opinion did not. I noticed it. I want to be clear that I noticed it every single time. I simply did not yet have anywhere to put that noticing. No evidence to attach it to. No folder or recorder or deed restriction to give the feeling a shape sturdy enough to act on. I only had a slow, growing sense that somewhere along the way, without ever quite deciding to, I had stopped being consulted about my own life. Around that same time, the comments from Carol started to sharpen. They were always delivered with a smile, always in front of other people, small enough that calling them out would have made me look unreasonable, which was, I now understand, precisely the design. At my own book club, she once said, laughing lightly, "Ellie's never been a numbers person. She just signs where Grant tells her to and trusts the rest to us." And every woman at that table laughed along with her, and I laughed too. Because what else do you do when your own sister paints you as helpless in front of your friends, and you don't yet have the evidence to prove otherwise? Thanksgiving of that first year fell 8 months after the funeral, and Carol insisted on hosting it herself in my own farmhouse, moving my dinner plates to make room for a matching set she'd ordered online, rearranging the good tablecloth Robert's mother had embroidered because, she said, the color didn't photograph well against the centerpiece she'd already chosen. I remember standing in my own dining room doorway that afternoon, watching my sister direct traffic around a table I had set for 38 Thanksgivings running, and feeling, for the first time, like a guest in a house I had built with my own 2 hands alongside my husband. 12 people came that year, mostly old friends of Robert's family, and a scattering of cousins from Carol's side who had never once, in my memory, made the drive out for a holiday before. Grant Pierce came too, which struck me as strange even then. A lawyer at a family Thanksgiving, seated not at the far end near the children's table where a guest that distant from the family ought to sit, but close to Carol, close enough to lean in and murmur something to her over the cranberry sauce that made her laugh behind her napkin. Nobody else seemed to find that odd. I told myself I was simply still raw, still grieving, still seeing shadows where there weren't any. I have since learned to distrust that particular kind of self-doubt more than almost anything else in the world. It was over dessert that Carol first said, in front of that full table, the words that would echo through the rest of that year and the two that followed. Someone, one of Robert's old fishing buddies, had asked politely whether I intended to keep the orchard running myself or whether I'd consider bringing on new management. And before I could answer, Carol set down her fork and answered for me. "Oh, Ellie's not really built for the business side of things," she said, laughing lightly, the same laugh she used at the book club months later. "She's the heart of this family, not the head of it. That's what the rest of us are here for." The table laughed along with her, warmly, affectionately, the way you laugh at a fond and familiar joke about someone you love. I laughed too. God help me, I laughed too, because contradicting her in front of 12 guests over pumpkin pie felt, in that moment, like more of a scene than I had the strength to make. Walt wasn't at that table, of course. Walt has never been the kind of man who accepts an invitation to sit at his employer's holiday dinner, no matter how many times I asked him over the years. But he stopped by the farmhouse 2 days later to drop off a load of firewood, and he found me alone in the kitchen scrubbing a roasting pan I didn't strictly need to scrub, just to have something to do with my hands. "Heard Thanksgiving got interesting," he said, in that careful, sideways way he had of bringing something up without quite bringing it up. I asked him what he meant. He shrugged, stacking the last of the firewood by the mudroom door. "Nothing, ma'am. Just, my late wife used to say you can tell a lot about how a family really works by who gets to make the jokes at the table and who has to sit there and take them." I didn't have an answer for that. I scrubbed that roasting pan until it shone like new, and I thought about his wife saying for a long time after he'd gone. The following spring brought a smaller humiliation, one I almost didn't count as one at the time, which I think now was exactly the point. The County Farming Co-op held its annual meeting in the Grange Hall 11 miles down the road, the same meeting Robert had attended every March for 30 years. And Carol insisted on coming along that year to represent the family, a phrase she used often enough by then that I'd stopped flinching at it. When the co-op president, an old friend of Robert's named Dwayne Fletcher, asked from the podium whether the Whitfield operation had any updates to share for the spring planting season, Carol stood up before I had even gathered my thoughts and answered on my behalf, outlining acreage figures and yield projections in a voice so confident and so entirely wrong in 3 separate details that I sat frozen in my folding chair, watching my own operation get described incorrectly to 40 of my closest neighbors by a woman who had never once picked an apple off a tree in her adult life. I corrected her afterward, quietly, in the parking lot, my voice low so the departing crowd wouldn't hear. Carol's face went tight and hurt in an instant, the particular hurt of someone who has decided, before you've even finished speaking, that whatever you say next will be an attack. "I was only trying to help you, Ellie," she said, her voice climbing just slightly, just enough to draw a glance from a passing neighbor. "You've had such a hard time keeping track of things since Robert passed. I don't know why you'd want to embarrass me over a few numbers when I'm the only one here trying to hold this family together." I apologized. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because I think it captures something true about how these years actually worked. My sister had just publicly misrepresented my own business to my own neighbors, and I was the one standing in a gravel parking lot apologizing for pointing it out. It was around that same time, the spring of the second year, that I drove out one gray afternoon to visit my mother's grave, something I did perhaps twice a year, tucked into the small church cemetery 2 towns over where she'd been laid to rest 4 years before Robert. I stood there a long while that day, the way you do at a grave that's had time to settle into ordinary grief rather than fresh grief, and I found myself thinking, unprompted, about her last 2 years. About the confusion that had crept into her near the end, about the way she used to ask me, gently and a little embarrassed, whether I knew what had happened to the money for the good chair, some specific expense she could never quite name or account for. I had told her each time not to worry about it, that Carol was handling everything and handling it well. I believed that completely at the time. Standing at her grave that gray afternoon, some old unease stirred in me that I couldn't yet name. A small, cold draft coming from underneath a door I hadn't thought to check. I mentioned it to Carol that same evening, carefully, almost apologetically, the way you bring up something you're half ashamed to even be wondering about. "Do you remember?" I asked her over the dishes. "Near the end, Mama kept asking about money for a chair, some kind of recliner or something. I never did figure out what she meant." Carol didn't even look up from the sink. "Oh, that," she said, easy as anything. "That was the specialized medical seating Medicare wouldn't cover, remember? I paid out of pocket for it so she wouldn't have to sit in that awful old recliner of hers. I never even mentioned it because I didn't want you feeling guilty you couldn't chip in at the time, with everything else going on." It was a good answer. It was warm and generous and entirely plausible, and it closed the door I had only just begun to notice was ajar. I thanked her for her kindness. I did not think of that conversation again for well over a year, not until a manila folder in a barn told me, in cold black and white figures, that there had never been any specialized medical seating at all. By the time Lily made her comment on the porch that second summer, the pattern I'm describing to you now had already been running for 2 full years. Each small humiliation a little heavier than the last. Each one dressed up in language that made it sound like love. Carol never once raised her voice at me in front of other people. She never needed to. She had learned, whether by instinct or by design, that the far more effective tool was warmth, delivered in public, aimed at making me look fragile rather than making herself look cruel. I want you to understand that distinction clearly, because I think it's the reason it took me as long as it did to see her plainly. Cruelty announces itself. What Carol did was quieter and, in its own way, far more dangerous, because it wore the exact shape of care. An old friend of mine, a woman named Barbara Doone, who'd known me since we were girls together at the county school, pulled me aside at a church supper that same summer and said something I brushed off at the time and have thought about nearly every day since. "Ellie," she said, taking my hand in both of hers the way she'd done since we were 9 years old. "I love your sister, I do, but I've noticed something, and I don't know if it's my place to say it. Every time I've seen you two together this past year, she talks about you like you're not quite in the room, even when you're standing right beside her." I told Barbara she was imagining things, that grief made everyone a little sensitive to slights that weren't really there. Barbara squeezed my hand once, let it go, and said only, "Maybe. You just keep your eyes open, is all I'm saying." I wish, more than almost anything else from those years, that I had let myself really hear her that evening instead of simply being polite about it. That sentence, "She just signs where we tell her to," became something of a signature line for Carol over those years, repeated in different forms at different tables, each time landing a little deeper under my skin, each time making it a little harder to imagine myself as a woman capable of running anything, let alone 42 acres and a legacy. That sentence, "She just signs where we tell her to," became something of a signature line for Carol over those years, repeated in different forms at different tables, each time landing a little deeper under my skin, each time making it a little harder to imagine myself as a woman capable of running anything, let alone 42 acres and a legacy. I want you to remember that phrase specifically. I promise you it comes back around, and when it does not land the way Carol intended. By the 2-year mark, Sarah had started to notice the tension over our Sunday phone calls, though from Denver, filtered through Carol's careful narration, she mostly heard a story about an overwhelmed mother and a generous, sacrificing aunt holding everything together. "Isn't it lucky Aunt Carol's there?" Sarah said to me once, And I remember biting back the urge to tell her exactly how lucky I felt, because I still didn't have proof of anything, only a slow, crawling unease I couldn't yet justify out loud. Lily, though. Lily noticed things her mother didn't. 12-year-olds notice more than we give them credit for. During her visit that second summer, Lily sat with me on the porch shelling peas, same as always, and out of nowhere she said, "Grandma, why does Aunt Carol talk about the orchard like it's already sold?" I asked her what she meant. She shrugged in that loose-limbed way kids do when they've said something bigger than they realized. She was on the phone with some man, talking about acreage and closing costs and once we're past probate. I don't really know what that means. I just thought it was weird she said we. I remember setting down the bowl of peas very carefully because my hands had started shaking and I didn't want Lily to see. That conversation was the first crack in the fog. I didn't march inside and confront Carol that day. I want to be honest about why. Part of it was fear, plain and simple. Fear of being wrong. Fear of destroying my relationship with my only living sister over a 12-year-old's overheard fragment of a phone call. But part of it, the larger part if I'm honest, was a colder, more familiar fear. The fear that if I was right, I had already lost so much control over my own life that I wouldn't know how to take it back. It took another 8 months for the next piece to fall into place. And it fell into place not because I went looking for it, but because Carol, growing more confident, grew careless. She left a printed email on the kitchen counter one evening while she went to answer the door for a delivery. A message from Grant Pierce's office addressed to her directly, not to me, discussing the Larkspur development offer and referencing, in a casual parenthetical, Eleanor's continued cooperation, which, per our last conversation, should not be an issue given her current arrangement. I read that sentence standing in my own kitchen, and something in my chest went very cold and very quiet, the way water goes still right before it freezes solid. I didn't say anything that night either. I want you to understand the discipline that took, because up until that point in my life, discipline had never been one of my strengths. Robert used to joke that I wore my feelings on the outside of my sweater, plain for anyone to read. But something in me had started to change, quietly, in the space between Lily's overheard phone call and that email on the counter. I had started, without fully realizing it, to become the kind of woman who watches instead of reacts. I think, looking back, that was Robert's letter working on me before I even knew it existed. Some instinct he'd planted in our marriage finally waking up when I needed it most. It was 3 weeks after that email that the courier arrived at my door with the sealed envelope from Renata Cole's office, the one that sent me to the barn. Robert's 3-year clause, timed by his attorney to release automatically on the anniversary unless canceled, had simply, coincidentally, cruelly, perfectly, arrived at the exact moment I most needed a dead man's foresight. I don't believe in fate as a rule. I believe mostly in preparation meeting circumstance. But I will admit that morning felt like something closer to a miracle than a coincidence. Now you understand the wound, and you understand why, when I finally read that letter in the barn, I wasn't entirely surprised by what it confirmed. I had already been circling the same cold water Robert had swum in years before me. What I hadn't expected was the depth of what he'd actually found, and what he'd left for me to finish. The manila folder marked evidence. For when she tries, sat on my kitchen table for 3 full days before I found the courage to go through it methodically, page by page, the way you'd disarm something you weren't entirely sure wouldn't explode in your hands. I made a pot of coffee I never drank. I locked the farmhouse door, which I never did during the day, and I told Carol, when she asked why I seemed distracted, that I hadn't slept well. That, at least, was entirely true. The first section of the folder was financial, meticulously organized, dated from the 8 months of Robert's illness. He had, it turned out, quietly hired a private forensic accountant named Priya Anand out of Burlington, a woman he'd found through a business contact from his farming co-op. someone with absolutely no connection to Grant Pierce, or to Carol, or to anyone in our small town's overlapping social circles. Priya's report, 31 pages long, traced the decline of our mother's retirement account in granular, undeniable detail. 14 withdrawals over 3 years, each one just under the threshold that would have triggered additional bank scrutiny. Each one made from an account Carol had sole signing authority over as our mother's designated caretaker. 14 withdrawals, totaling $52,400, none of it corresponding to any documented medical expense, care facility invoice, or household cost Priya could identify anywhere in our mother's financial history. 14. I sat there staring at that number until it stopped looking like a number and started looking like a pattern, a rhythm, a habit, as deliberate as anything Carol had ever done in her life. The second section of the folder was more recent, and this was the part that made my hands go cold. Robert, in the final months before he died, had asked Priya to quietly monitor, through entirely legal, public, and semi-public financial records, any unusual activity connected to our own farm accounts, the ones Carol would eventually gain access to through the power of attorney I would sign 4 months after his death. He hadn't known the exact mechanism Carol would use. He'd simply known, with the certainty of a man who'd watched this pattern once already, that a mechanism would appear. Priya's follow-up notes, added and dated over the 3 years since Robert's death, tracked exactly what Walt had noticed in that cold equipment shed. A new operating account opened 4 months after the funeral, the same week I signed the power of attorney. Transfers out of that account, 22 of them over 3 years, totaling just over $114,000, routed through a shell entity registered to an address that traced back to Grant Pierce's own office suite. My sister and my sister's lawyer had built a pipeline directly out of my grief, and they had done it in careful, deniable increments, exactly the way Carol had once drained our mother's account. Exactly the pattern my husband had died certain she would repeat. The third section of the folder, thinner than the others, contained something I hadn't expected at all. Photocopies of 2 separate documents bearing my signature. A signature that was close, unnervingly close, to my own, but that I knew the moment I looked at them side by side with an actual sample of my handwriting, I had never written. One was an amendment expanding the scope of Carol's power of attorney beyond what I had originally signed. The other was a preliminary listing agreement for the orchard property, dated 11 months earlier, a full 7 months before I had any knowledge whatsoever that a sale was even being contemplated. I laid those 2 photocopies side by side on my kitchen table, and then, with hands that had gone strangely steady now that the worst of the shock had settled into something colder, I dug through the kitchen drawer where I kept old greeting cards and pulled out a birthday card I had signed for Lily only the previous spring, just to have something genuine to compare against. I am not a document examiner. I want to be honest about that. I had no formal training in anything resembling forensic handwriting analysis. Only 61 years of having written my own name across checks and school permission slips and anniversary cards more times than I could ever count. But even I could see it once I looked closely enough. My real signature slants forward with a small, distinctive hook at the tail of the final D in Whitfield, a habit I picked up decades ago from my mother's own signature and never bothered to correct. The signature on that listing agreement did not have the hook. It curved instead into a soft, uncertain loop, the kind of mistake someone makes when they are copying a shape rather than writing a name they have made their own through 40 years of repetition. I sat there for a long while, simply staring at that difference, that one small missing hook, and I felt something twist in my chest that was not quite anger yet, not quite grief, but some third thing I did not have a name for at the time. Someone, somewhere, had sat down with a sample of my handwriting, likely lifted from some old check or document Carol had access to through the very power of attorney I had signed in good faith, and had practiced forming my name until it was close enough to fool a notary who was not looking too carefully, or who perhaps had simply been told not to look carefully at all. I thought about all the paperwork Grant Pierce had shuffled across my kitchen table over 3 years, all the pages I had signed quickly, trustingly, without reading past the first paragraph because I had been told, repeatedly, gently, that I did not need to understand the details. I wondered, sitting there in the quiet of that kitchen, how many other pages in that pile might have carried my real signature beside pages I had never actually touched at all, slipped in among documents I had genuinely signed, indistinguishable to anyone but me, and perhaps not even to me. I thought, too, about the specific date on that listing agreement, 11 months earlier, a full 7 months before Carol had ever mentioned the word sale to me directly. I did the arithmetic in my head, slowly, the way you count out change when your hands are shaking. 11 months earlier put the date squarely in the same season Carol had stood up at the county co-op meeting and answered Dwayne Fletcher's questions about my orchard's spring planting numbers before I'd had the chance to answer them myself. It put it only a few weeks after the remembrance lunch, where she had first said the words, "long-term plans for the property," within my hearing. Words I had questioned and been told, gently, that I was reading far too much into small talk. I understood now, sitting at that kitchen table with a forged listing agreement in one hand and my granddaughter's genuine birthday card in the other, that I had not been reading too much into anything at all. I had been reading exactly the right amount. I had simply not yet had the evidence to trust my own reading. There was a second document clipped behind the listing agreement, one I had almost overlooked in my focus on the forged signatures. A formal appraisal request Grant Pierce's office had submitted to a commercial real estate assessor out of Burlington, dated the same week as the forged listing agreement, requesting a valuation of 42 acres of agricultural and potentially reasonable hillside property, for what the form described only as estate planning purposes. I sat with that phrase for a long moment. Estate planning purposes. A phrase so bland and bureaucratic it could have meant almost anything. And yet I understood, reading it in the context of everything else in that folder, exactly what it actually meant. They had been pricing my husband's family legacy for sale while he was still alive to smell the cider pressing in that barn every autumn, while I was still bringing him tea in the hospice room and holding his hand through the worst nights of his illness, while our own daughter still believed, 1,000 miles away in Denver, that her aunt was simply the family's devoted, exhausted caretaker. I want to tell you honestly that I did not immediately think of calling Renata Cole in that moment, though I knew her name by then and knew, vaguely, that Robert had mentioned trusting her. What I thought of first, sitting there with the birthday card and the forged documents spread in front of me like evidence at a trial only I had been invited to attend, was a memory from very early in our marriage. Robert standing at our kitchen counter, maybe 5 years into our life together, teaching me how to balance a checkbook the way his own grandfather had taught him. Patient and thorough in a way that had nothing to do with doubting my intelligence, and everything to do with wanting me to understand every single piece of the life we were building together. He had never once, in 38 years, treated my understanding of our finances as optional. It was Carol who had taught me, slowly and carefully, that not understanding was somehow safer, somehow more restful, somehow the appropriate role for a grieving woman to play. Sitting there with proof of her forgery in my own hands, I understood exactly how much that lesson had cost me, and exactly how deliberately it had been taught. I gathered the 2 forged documents and the appraisal request back together, careful not to smudge or crease anything. Some instinct already telling me, even before I fully understood why, that these particular pages would need to survive intact and unaltered for whatever came next. I slid them beneath the financial section of the folder, and it was only then, shifting that stack of papers to make room, that I noticed the folded note clipped to the back corner, small enough that I had missed it entirely on my first pass through the folder 3 days earlier. Robert's own note, clipped to these 2 documents, read simply, "If it comes to this, get a document examiner. Renata knows one. I am so sorry I couldn't stop this from where I was standing. I could only build you the tools to stop it yourself." Robert's own note, clipped to these 2 documents, read simply, "If it comes to this, get a document examiner. Renata knows one. I am so sorry I couldn't stop this from where I was standing. I could only build you the tools to stop it yourself." I sat in my kitchen and I cried in a way I hadn't cried since the day we buried him. Not because I was afraid anymore, but because somewhere in the middle of dying, my husband had spent his failing strength thinking only about how to protect me from a war he wouldn't live to see fought. There was a 4th section, and this one, I confess, took me the longest to work up the courage to open, because it wasn't documents. It was a small digital voice recorder, the old-fashioned kind with a tiny built-in speaker, along with a note in Robert's hand that read, "I recorded this the week after your mother's funeral, when Carol thought I was asleep in the next room. I've kept it 3 years. I hope you never need to hear it. If you're listening, I'm sorry you do." I want to tell you honestly that I sat with that recorder unplayed for 2 full days before I could make myself press the button. Some part of me, I think, still wanted to believe there was an innocent explanation waiting on the other side of that little speaker, some version of my sister I could still love without reservation. Grief does that. It keeps a door open for people long after they've stopped deserving the key. When I finally pressed play, sitting alone at that kitchen table at 11 o'clock at night with the farmhouse dark and silent around me, I heard my sister's voice, unmistakably hers, lower and harder than I had ever heard it directed at me, speaking to someone on the phone. "The old woman won't even remember by morning," Carol said, and I heard ice cubes clinking against a glass in the background. "That's the whole beauty of it, Grant. Nobody questions a confused 80-year-old's memory of her own bank statements. By the time Ellie's husband gets around to noticing anything, if he even lives long enough to notice, we'll be long past the point where it matters." I almost reached for the recorder to shut it off right there, my thumb already hovering over the small, worn button, because some part of me still wanted to believe that sentence was the worst of it. That I could stop the tape, put the lid back on the box, and go on believing I had only just barely glimpsed the edge of something rather than its whole shape. I didn't shut it off. I made myself sit with my hand flat on the table instead, the way you brace yourself before a doctor tells you something you've already half guessed. And I let the tape keep running. Grant's voice came through next, tinny and distant through that small speaker. The sound of a man pouring himself a drink of his own somewhere on the other end of the line. "You're sure the account holds up?" he said. "Sure nobody at that little co-op bank starts asking why an 81-year-old woman's caretaker needs signing authority on 4 separate withdrawals in a single quarter?" Carol's laugh, when it came, was the same laugh I had heard 100 times across 100 dinner tables, warm and easy and entirely without weight. "Grant," she said, "I have been managing that woman's checkbook since she couldn't remember what day of the week it was. Nobody at that bank has asked me a single question in 3 years, and they're not going to start now. The only person who might ever notice is Ellie, and Ellie's never been the sharp one. She just signs where we tell her to, always has. ever since we were girls. I was the one who had to explain things twice before she understood them. I want you to understand what it cost me to hear my own sister say that sentence about me on a tape recorded in secret in my own home. Not because it was cruel, though it was, but because some old, tired part of me still half believed it was true. The tape kept running. Grant asked about the timeline, and Carol answered without a moment's hesitation, the numbers coming off her tongue as easily as a grocery list. 14 withdrawals, spread out so none of them trip a reporting threshold, and once probate closes on Mama's estate, there's nothing left for anyone to trace, even if they went looking. The medical expense story holds up fine. Nobody questions medical expenses on an elderly woman. Everybody assumes the worst about how much end-of-life care actually costs. There was a pause on the tape then. The particular kind of pause where you can almost hear someone deciding how much further to go. And then Carol's voice again, lower this time, almost thoughtful, the way you'd talk about a long-term investment rather than a family member's savings. The orchard's the real prize, though. $60,000 out of Mama's account is nothing compared to what that land is worth once Bob's gone. Rural parcels that size don't stay farmland forever, not with development creeping up from the interstate the way it has been. Whitfield land, 42 acres, unspoiled hillside. That's worth real money to the right buyer, and Ellie will sign whatever Ellie's told to sign, especially once she's grieving and too tired to read past the first page. I sat in my kitchen that night and I understood, all at once, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that I had not stumbled into my sister's greed by accident, the way you stumble into an unlocked door left open by carelessness. I had been a line item in a plan for years, a variable Carol had already calculated and accounted for long before Robert's diagnosis ever gave that plan a starting date. The orchard was never simply an opportunity she noticed once grief made me vulnerable. It had been the destination the whole time, and our mother's savings account had only ever been a smaller, earlier rehearsal for the exact same performance. The recording ran another 4 minutes after that, mostly logistics I would come to know intimately over the following days, a shell entity Carol and Grant were calling, with a kind of joking corporate cheer that made my skin crawl, the holding company, registered under a name neither Robert nor I had ever heard before that night. Cascade Ridge Partners, an entity that existed, as Priya's later forensic report would confirm in bloodless, exact language, solely to receive and disperse funds without either of their names appearing anywhere on the paperwork, a curious bank teller or a suspicious relative might someday think to request. Grant mentioned, almost in passing, a document examiner he knew, a man he described as reasonably priced and entirely discreet, who could, for a modest fee, produce a signature close enough to mine to satisfy any notary who wasn't looking too closely. I would learn later that this was, almost word for word, the exact opposite of the man Renata Cole would eventually introduce me to, a strange, bitter little symmetry that has never entirely left me since. The last thing on that recording, before the tape clicked off into silence, was Carol's voice again, quieter now, almost tender, the way you'd talk about someone you loved rather than someone you were actively robbing. "I do feel a little bad about Ellie," she said. "She really has had such a hard time. But somebody in this family has always had to be the practical one, Grant, and it was never going to be her. I'm not stealing from my sister. I'm just finally getting paid for 30 years of being the one who actually handles things while everybody else gets to be soft." I sat with that sentence longer than almost anything else on the tape, because I think it revealed something about Carol that all the numbers in Priya's report never quite managed to capture on their own. She did not see herself as a thief. She saw herself as someone finally collecting a debt she believed the entire family had owed her since childhood, and that belief, more than any dollar figure, was the truest, coldest thing I learned about my sister in that entire dark kitchen. I played the tape 3 more times that night, not because I doubted what I'd heard, but because some part of me kept hoping that a 4th or 5th listen might soften it somehow, might reveal some context I'd missed that made my sister smaller and less deliberate than she sounded. It never did. By the 4th listen, sometime past 1 in the morning, I finally reached over and pressed the small, worn button to shut the recorder off for good, and I set it down on the kitchen table beside Robert's letter, and I looked at the two of them together, a dead man's careful preparation laid next to his sister-in-law's careless confession, and I understood that I was no longer the same woman who had knelt on that barn floor that morning, wondering what forgiveness her husband thought he owed her. I sat perfectly still in that dark kitchen and listened to my sister discuss my dying husband's remaining lifespan as a scheduling convenience. I sat perfectly still in that dark kitchen and listened to my sister discuss my dying husband's remaining lifespan as a scheduling convenience. I want to tell you I screamed, or threw something, or did any of the things you might expect from a woman hearing her own sister's true voice for the first time. I didn't. I sat very quietly, and I felt something inside me that had been bent for 3 years finally, completely, straighten out. Robert had been right. He had been right about all of it, and he had died carrying that certainty alone, because he loved me too much to make me carry it with him before I had to. I turned that recorder off, and I sat in the dark for a long time, and somewhere in that silence, the woman who used to apologize for asking questions at her own kitchen table quietly finished dying. And someone else, someone colder and clearer and considerably more dangerous to underestimate, sat up in her place. I did not cry again that night. I made a list instead. The list had 4 names on it. Renata Cole, the attorney my husband had trusted with a secret this large. Priya Anand, the forensic accountant who had already done half the work I needed done. Walt Higgins, who had been keeping his own quiet record in a locked notebook for 3 years, waiting for someone to ask him to open it. And a name I didn't yet know, a document examiner Renata could apparently point me toward, someone who could tell a courtroom, definitively, that the signature on that listing agreement had never come from my hand. I called Renata Cole's office the very next morning, 6 days before Carol's autumn preview. 6 days before the closing my sister believed was already a foregone conclusion. Her assistant told me Ms. Cole had, in fact, been expecting my call for 3 years, with instructions on file to clear her calendar the same day it finally came. Some part of my husband, it seemed, had never stopped working on my behalf, even from wherever he was now. I hung up the phone, looked out the kitchen window at the orchard rows climbing the hill in the pale morning light, and for the first time in 3 years, I did not feel like a widow standing alone against the world. Renata Cole's office was a converted farmhouse 2 counties over, all exposed beams and law books, and she greeted me at the door herself rather than sending an assistant. A tall woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical knot, and the kind of handshake that told you immediately she did not waste time on pleasantries she didn't mean. "Eleanor," she said, before I'd even taken off my coat, "your husband was the most stubborn client I ever had, and I mean that as the highest compliment I know how to give. Sit down. We have 6 days, and I intend to use every hour of them." She laid it all out for me in plain, unhurried language, the way you'd explain a machine to someone who needed to operate it under pressure rather than simply admire its design. The deed restriction Robert had filed was airtight, she confirmed, cross-referencing the county recorder's own database on her laptop screen in front of me. Any sale, transfer, or lien against the orchard property required my sole, notarized, in-person signature, full stop, regardless of any power of attorney executed before or after its filing. Carol's entire closing, The autumn preview, the buyer, the $1.8 million offer from Larkspur Development, all of it was, in the strictest legal sense, already dead in the water. Carol simply didn't know it yet. But, Renata said, holding up one finger, a dead deal isn't the same as justice, Eleanor. If all you do is quietly block the sale, your sister walks away having stolen over $160,000 from you and your mother, forged 2 legal documents, and she'll simply try again in some other form 6 months from now, once she's regrouped. Your husband didn't build you a wall, he built you a case. The question is whether you want to just stop her, or whether you want her stopped for good. I sat in that converted farmhouse office, and I thought about Lily on the porch, shelling peas, asking why Aunt Carol talked about the orchard like it was already sold. I thought about my mother's confused final years, about $52,000 that vanished into 14 careful withdrawals nobody ever explained to her satisfaction. I thought about Robert, recording his own sister-in-law's voice at midnight because he loved his wife too much to let her walk into a trap unarmed. I want her stopped for good, I said. Tell me what that requires. What it required, Renata explained, was patience, precision, and silence. The same 3 things Robert had asked of me in his letter. We would need Priya Anand's financial forensics formally certified and prepared for submission to law enforcement. We would need a licensed document examiner to formally authenticate the forged signatures, someone Renata already had in mind, a retired FBI question document specialist named Harold Okafor, who now consulted privately out of Burlington. We would need Walt's 3 years of handwritten observations, properly notarized as a witness statement. And we would need, Renata said, leaning forward with the particular intensity of a woman who clearly relished this part of her job. A moment, a public moment ideally, where the truth can do the maximum amount of good with the maximum number of witnesses. Because women like your sister rely on private negotiation to survive. Take away her privacy, and you take away her leverage. I told her about the autumn preview, Carol's open house scheduled for 6 days out, a catered event meant to showcase the orchard to Larkspur's executives and half the town before the ink was even dry on paperwork Carol didn't know was legally worthless. Renata's expression shifted into something that looked, disconcertingly, like delight. That, she said, is our moment. Eleanor, how do you feel about hosting a party? Over the following days, I became someone I hardly recognized, and I mean that as the highest praise I can offer myself. I drove to Burlington and sat across from Harold Okafor, a soft-spoken man in his 70s with a magnifying loupe and 40 years of federal document examination behind him, and I watched him lay my genuine signature beside the forged listing agreement under bright, clinical light, tracing pen pressure and letter formation with the patient authority of a surgeon. Your sister's forger was good, he told me, not unkindly, but good isn't perfect. There's a hesitation mark here, on the crossbar of the E, that your genuine signature never shows. Whoever did this practiced from a photograph, not from watching you actually sign your name. I can certify that in writing, and I can testify to it in court if it ever comes to that. I met with Priya Anand next, in a glass-walled conference room that felt like a different universe from my farmhouse kitchen, and she walked me through her 31-page report, line by line, until I understood every column of it as well as she did. Your husband asked me to be thorough, she said, sliding a bound copy across the table to me. And then he asked me to be patient, which was harder. He wanted this ready the moment you needed it, not a day sooner. Because he said, and I remember this exactly, she needs to grieve fully before she fights, or the fight won't be clean. He was a very unusual man, Mrs. Whitfield. I visited Walt in the equipment shed on the 4th day, and he handed me his composition notebook without a word. 3 years of dates and dollar figures and small, careful observations written in the same steady hand he used to log tree disease and irrigation schedules. "I kept waiting for you to ask," he said, wiping his hands on a shop rag that had seen 30 years of honest work. "I didn't want to push you before you were ready to hear it. Figured that wasn't my place. But I'll stand up in front of God and everybody and say what I saw, Eleanor, whenever you need me to." I hugged him, which I don't think either of us expected, and neither of us said anything else about it, because some loyalties don't need to be discussed out loud to be understood. On the 5th day, Renata and I drove together to the county sheriff's office, where we met with a detective from the Financial Crimes Division named Marisol Ruiz, a compact, sharp-eyed woman who listened to our entire presentation without interrupting once, flipping through Priya's report and Harold's authentication letter with the focused stillness of someone assembling a case in real time behind her eyes. "Mrs. Whitfield," she said finally, closing the last folder, "I want to be honest with you. Elder financial exploitation cases are some of the hardest to prosecute because families protect families even when they shouldn't. But this?" She tapped the stack of documents. "This is about as clean a paper trail as I've seen in 11 years on this desk. If even half of what's in here holds up, your sister is looking at forgery, at exploitation of a vulnerable adult regarding your mother's accounts, and at wire fraud regarding the shell transfers. Give me the word, and I can have officers ready to move the moment you need them." I asked her, carefully, whether those officers could be present at a private event 6 days from then, without alerting anyone in advance, without tipping our hand before the moment was right. Detective Ruiz smiled for the first time since we'd sat down. "Mrs. Whitfield," she said, "I've been waiting 3 years for somebody to hand me a case this solid. I'll be there myself. Just tell me the address." The final piece fell into place on the 6th morning, the morning of the autumn preview itself, when I finally opened the last section of Robert's lockbox, a small brass safe deposit key I'd found taped beneath the recorder, along with a note reading only, "First National, Box 214. One more thing you'll want to see." I drove to the bank alone that morning, my hands steady in a way they hadn't been in 3 years, and the branch manager walked me back to a small private room where a bank officer pulled the long metal box from the wall and left me alone with it. Inside, wrapped in the same careful cloth Robert had used for everything else, I found a single document, the original notarized codicil to Robert's will, executed the same week as the deed restriction, naming me sole and exclusive owner of the orchard property outright, superseding any prior joint ownership language that Carol's lawyer might otherwise have tried to argue created ambiguity. There was no ambiguity left to argue. My husband had closed every door 3 years before Carol ever tried to walk through one. Beside the codicil sat one final short note, and I want to read it to you exactly as he wrote it, because I have carried these words in my chest every day since. "Ellie," it said, "you have always been the capable one, no matter what anyone in that family ever told either of us growing up. I am so sorry I am not there to stand beside you for this, but I promise you, I have never once, not for a single day, left you standing alone. Go to the barn. Take back what's yours. And Ellie, don't let her see you shake." I sat in that small private bank room, and I read those words until I had them memorized. And then I folded the codicil carefully back into its cloth, and I drove home to get ready for the autumn preview. Because 6 days of quiet preparation had brought me to exactly the moment my husband had been building toward for 3 years, and I intended to meet it standing perfectly, completely straight. I had exactly 6 hours between that bank vault and the first cars turning up the gravel drive for the autumn preview. And I want to tell you honestly that I spent the first hour of it simply sitting in my car in the First National parking lot, the engine off, my hands resting on the wheel, doing absolutely nothing but breathing. 6 days is not very long to rebuild a woman from the ground up, and yet somehow those 6 days had done exactly that, and I needed a few quiet minutes alone to feel the shape of who I had become before I asked her to stand up in front of a barn full of witnesses. Sarah's flight had landed in Burlington the night before, a detail I had arranged 3 days earlier with Renata's help, and had kept, along with everything else, entirely hidden from Carol. I hadn't told my daughter the full truth over the phone. I couldn't bear to compress 3 years of betrayal into a single call, and then ask her to fly across the country and act normal at a family gathering the very next afternoon. Instead, I had told her only that something important was happening with the orchard, that I needed her there, and that I needed her, more than anything, to trust me enough not to ask too many questions until I could explain everything in person. Sarah, bless her, had booked the flight within the hour. "Mom," she'd said, her voice tight with a worry she was clearly trying to keep out of it, "you've never once in my whole life asked me to trust you blindly. I'm coming. Just please be careful." She was waiting for me at the farmhouse when I got back from the bank that morning, standing in the kitchen doorway in the same worn barn coat she used to wear as a teenager. And the moment she saw my face, she crossed the room and put her arms around me before either of us said a single word. "You look different," she said finally, pulling back to study me the way only a daughter can study her own mother, cataloging every small change since the last time she'd looked closely. Not bad different, just different. I told her she had no idea how different, and then, sitting at that same kitchen table where I had first read Robert's letter aloud to no one but myself, I finally told my daughter everything. I watched her face move through every stage of it, the confusion, the disbelief, the slow dawning horror as I laid out the numbers, the forged signatures, the recording, the deed restriction her father had filed without either of us knowing. When I finished, Sarah sat very still for a long moment, her hands pressed flat against the table exactly the way mine had been 6 days earlier. And then she said, in a voice gone hard in a way I had never once heard from my gentle, easygoing daughter, "I want to be there this afternoon. Whatever you're planning, I want to be standing right beside you when it happens." I told her that was exactly where I wanted her. Lily, she told me, had insisted on flying out too, the moment she'd overheard her mother's end of a phone call the night before, and was currently up in her old bedroom changing out of travel clothes into something, in her own words relayed through Sarah, appropriately serious for taking down Aunt Carol. I laughed for the first time in what felt like a very long while. 13 years old, and already braver about the whole thing than I had been at 58. Walt arrived at noon with the last of what I'd asked him to bring. 3 years of his composition notebook photocopied and bound at the county print shop. Along with a folding chair he insisted on setting up near the barn side entrance, in case anybody needs somewhere steady to sit once things get moving. I understood exactly what he meant by that, and exactly who he meant it for, though he was too much of a gentleman to say Carol's name out loud in connection with it. Detective Ruiz called at noon to confirm her officers would arrive discreetly, parked 2 properties down the road until she gave the signal. Dressed plainly enough to blend in among the caterers and delivery trucks already crowding my driveway. Renata arrived at 1, carrying a slim leather folder of her own that made me think, with a small private smile, of the very different folder Grant Pierce had once carried into this same kitchen to take my life apart, one signature at a time. It was Renata who found me upstairs an hour before the first guests were due, standing in front of my closet with the door open, staring at a row of soft, forgettable cardigans and floral blouses I had worn for 3 years, to make myself as small and unremarkable as possible in every room I entered. "Eleanor," she said from the doorway, "may I make a suggestion?" I told her she could. She walked past me into the closet without hesitation and pulled out a single garment bag tucked far in the back, one I had nearly forgotten I owned. A tailored charcoal suit Robert had bought me for our 30th anniversary. The one nice thing in my wardrobe I had never once had the occasion, or perhaps the courage, to wear since he died. "Your husband spent 3 years building you a case that would hold up in any courtroom in this state," Renata said, unzipping the bag and laying the suit across the bed with the quiet reverence of someone handling something sacred. "I think it's time you stopped dressing like a woman who needs to be underestimated." I put on that suit alone in my bedroom, buttoning the jacket slowly, watching myself take shape in the same mirror I had avoided for 3 long years of grief-softened cardigans and unwashed hair pulled back in a hurry. The woman looking back at me from that mirror stood a little taller than the one who had knelt on the barn floor 6 days earlier. She did not look like a widow anyone would describe ever again as someone who simply signs where she's told to. She looked, for the first time since Robert's funeral, exactly like herself. Lily found me at the top of the stairs a few minutes later, dressed in her own version of appropriately serious, a navy dress with her hair pulled back the way her grandfather used to braid it for her when she was small. And she studied me for a long moment with the particular seriousness only a 13-year-old can summon. "Grandma," she said finally, "you look like you're about to win something." I told her I certainly hoped so. She slipped her small hand into mine on the stairs, the same gesture she'd used since she was 4 years old, climbing down from the porch to chase fireflies. And together we walked down into a kitchen full of quiet, purposeful people who had all, in their own separate ways, spent 6 days helping build the moment that was about to arrive. I want to tell you about the last few minutes before the first cars turned up the drive, because I think they matter more than almost anything else in this story. I stood alone for just a moment on the back porch, looking up the hill at the barn, string lights already glowing faintly against the late afternoon sky. And I thought about Robert, standing in that same doorway 38 years earlier, pointing down at 40 acres of rocky hillside and telling me it wasn't much, but it was his, and he wanted it to be ours. It had taken his death and 3 years of quiet betrayal and a locked box behind a stack of quilts to teach me exactly how much that promise had always meant, and exactly how far he had been willing to reach across his own death to keep it. I thought, too, about the folder in Renata's hands, about Harold Okafor's careful magnifying loupe, about Priya Anand's 31 pages of patient, damning arithmetic, about Detective Ruiz, parked 2 properties down the road with officers waiting for a single word from me. Every piece of it, I realized, standing on that porch in a suit I hadn't worn in 3 years, had been assembled not out of anger, though I carried plenty of that, but out of the same love Robert had built this orchard on in the first place. This was never only about punishing my sister. This was about making sure that Lily, someday, could stand on this same hill and know exactly whose hands had kept it standing. Sarah came out onto the porch to find me, slipping her arm through mine the way she used to when she was small, and the world felt too big for her to face alone. "Are you ready?" she asked quietly. I told her I had never been more ready for anything in my entire life, and I meant it in a way that surprised even me, a calm settling over my chest that felt less like adrenaline and more like the particular stillness of a woman who has finally stopped arguing with her own strength. Down at the bottom of the drive, the first line of cars was already turning in through the gate, headlights catching the gold afternoon light, carrying half the town and a room full of strangers toward a party none of them yet understood was already over before it began. The autumn preview began at 4 o'clock on a crisp, golden Saturday afternoon, the kind of light that makes even an ordinary orchard look like something out of a painting, which I suspect was precisely why Carol had chosen that hour. The autumn preview began at 4 o'clock on a crisp, golden Saturday afternoon, the kind of light that makes even an ordinary orchard look like something out of a painting, which I suspect was precisely why Carol had chosen that hour. String lights had been hung between the barn's support beams, the same beams that had once hidden my husband's lockbox, and a catering crew Carol had hired at what I would later learn was a cost of nearly $4,000 was arranging apple cider donuts and mulled cider on long tables draped in burlap runners. The whole scene staged with the careful, expensive rusticity of a magazine spread designed to sell 42 acres to a room full of strangers. Larkspur Development had sent 3 representatives, led by a smooth, silver-templed man named Preston Marsh, who shook my hand with the practiced warmth of someone who had clearly been told I was the grieving, agreeable widow, and nothing more. Half the town had turned out, too, drawn by free cider and small-town curiosity, along with several of the same book club women who had once laughed along when Carol joked that I only signed where I was told. Grant Pierre stood near the barn entrance in an expensive overcoat, checking his watch, clearly anxious to move things along toward a signature he believed was merely a formality. Carol found me near the cider table 40 minutes into the event, resplendent in a cream wool coat I didn't recognize, her smile as warm and practiced as it had been for 3 years straight. "You look wonderful, Ellie," she said, squeezing my arm in that particular way she had, affectionate on the surface, controlling underneath. "I know today's a big step, but you don't need to worry about the details. Grant has everything ready. You just need to sign where he shows you, same as always, and then you can go back to enjoying your retirement instead of carrying all this weight." There it was, the exact phrase, nearly word for word, 3 years in the making. You just need to sign where he shows you. I smiled back at her, and for the first time in 3 years, my smile was not a mask hiding exhaustion. It was a mask hiding a verdict already rendered. "Actually, Carol," I said, keeping my voice light, pleasant, exactly the voice she expected from me. "Before anyone signs anything, I think it's time everyone here understood exactly what they're looking at." Something flickered across her face, quick and gone. The first crack of uncertainty I had seen in 3 years. I turned toward the small portable speaker system the caterers had set up for background music, and I nodded to Renata Cole, who had been standing quietly near the barn's side entrance the entire afternoon, dressed unremarkably enough that no one had given her a second look. Renata stepped forward and asked, in a calm, carrying voice that pulled every conversation in that barn to a stop, whether she could have everyone's attention for just a few minutes before any further business proceeded. Preston Marsh frowned. Grant Pierce's hand froze halfway to his coat pocket, where I would later learn the closing documents had been waiting. Carol's smile stayed fixed on her face, but her eyes had gone very still, the way an animal goes still right before it decides whether to run. "My name is Renata Cole," she began, "and I represent Eleanor Whitfield in a legal capacity that predates today's event by several years. I want to make something very clear before this closing proceeds any further. There is a recorded, restrictive covenant on this property's deed, filed 3 years ago, requiring Eleanor Whitfield's sole, in-person, notarized signature for any sale, transfer, or encumbrance of this land. No power of attorney executed before or after that filing can override it. This sale, as currently structured, is not legally possible." A murmur went through the crowd like wind through the orchard rows outside. Preston Marsh turned to Grant Pierce with an expression that had gone from confusion to fury in the space of a single breath. "That's absurd," Carol said, her voice climbing half an octave, the practiced sweetness cracking at the edges for the first time in 3 years in front of witnesses. "Grant, tell them that's absurd. Ellie's power of attorney gives us full authority. We've had this cleared for months." "Cleared by whom, Carol?" I said, and I want you to understand that my voice did not shake, not once, not for the rest of that entire evening. "Because I never signed a listing agreement for this property. I never expanded your power of attorney beyond the original document. And I have a certified document examiner's report proving both of those signatures were forged." The barn went silent, in a way that no barn full of people and string lights and mulled cider should ever be able to go silent. I could hear the caterer's warming trays humming in the background. I could hear my own heartbeat, steady, unhurried, exactly the way Robert had asked me to be. Carol's face had gone the color of the cream wool coat she was wearing. "You don't understand what you're accusing me of," she said, her voice dropping into something low and dangerous, the voice from the recorder, the voice she'd used with Grant 3 years ago about our dying mother. "I have taken care of you for 3 years, Eleanor. I gave up my own life to manage this mess for you because you were too broken to do it yourself. Is this how you repay me?" I stepped closer to her, close enough that only she and the small circle of witnesses immediately around us could hear my next words clearly, though in truth, in that stunned silence, I think everyone heard anyway. "You didn't manage a mess for me, Carol," I said. "You built one. You drained $52,000 from our mother's account in 14 withdrawals over 3 years and told the family it went to medical bills nobody wanted to itemize. You drained over $114,000 from my orchard accounts through a shell company registered to Grant's own office. And you told him, on a recording I have listened to more times than I care to admit, that our mother wouldn't remember by morning, and that you'd be long past the point where it mattered by the time my dying husband noticed anything at all." The color that had drained from Carol's face seemed to drain from the entire room. Preston Marsh took a visible step backward from Grant Pierce, the instinctive retreat of a man calculating his own liability in real time. Several of the book club women near the cider table had their hands pressed to their mouths. Somewhere behind me, I heard Walt's low, steady voice say, quietly but clearly, "Everything Eleanor just said, I can confirm firsthand. I've got 3 years of records to back every bit of it." "You're lying," Carol said, but her voice had lost its footing entirely now, climbing toward the ragged edge of panic. "This is a misunderstanding. This is grief talking, Eleanor. You're not thinking clearly." "I have never thought more clearly in my life," I said, and I meant every word of it. I reached into the leather folio I had been carrying all afternoon, the same kind of folio Grant Pierce had once brought to my kitchen table to take my life apart, one signature at a time, and I withdrew a single document, the notarized codicil from the safe deposit box, and I held it up so that Preston Marsh, standing rigid with fury a few feet away, could see it clearly. This orchard has been solely and exclusively mine since 3 months before my husband died. There was never a sale for you to broker, Mr. Marsh. I'm sorry your firm spent money on tonight's catering. I'd suggest you speak with your legal team about who authorized this event in the first place. Preston Marsh turned on Grant Pierce with an expression I can only describe as murderous. You told us this deal was airtight, he snapped. You told us the estate transfer was clean. Grant Pierce, to his credit, or perhaps simply out of self-preservation, said absolutely nothing, already backing toward the barn's side door, the same door Renata had entered through less than 10 minutes earlier. He didn't make it. Detective Marisol Ruiz stepped through that same side entrance, flanked by 2 uniformed officers, her badge already out, her voice calm and utterly without theater. Grant Pierce, Carol Bishop, I'm going to need both of you to stay right where you are. We have some questions regarding financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult and forged legal instruments, and I'd rather we handle this without any further disruption to what looks like a very nice party. A ripple of gasps went through the crowd, half horrified, half, I confess, unable to look away. Carol turned to me with an expression I had never once seen on my sister's face in 57 years of knowing her. Something raw and childlike and utterly stripped of its usual careful control. Ellie, please, she said, her voice cracking entirely now, all pretense gone. Please, you don't understand. I needed the money. Things have been so hard since the divorce. I was going to pay it back. I swear to you, I was always going to pay it back. I looked at my sister, standing in the wreckage of the scene she had built, in a barn my husband had built with his own hands, surrounded by string lights meant to sell away everything 3 generations of a family had worked for. And I felt something I hadn't expected to feel in that moment. Not triumph, not quite. Something quieter and sadder underneath the vindication. You were never going to pay it back, Carol, I said. You weren't paying anything back from Mama either, and it's been 11 years. I loved you my whole life. I am done being the person who has to prove that love by disappearing myself for your comfort. Detective Ruiz stepped forward at that point, and I watched as she read Carol her rights in a barn that had gone so quiet you could hear the apple crates settling in the cold evening air outside. Grant Pierce went first, silent, his face a mask of controlled calculation, even now already, I suspected, rehearsing whatever version of events his own lawyer would eventually construct on his behalf. Carol went second, and she did not go quietly. She wept, openly, in front of Preston Marsh and the book club women and the caterers still holding trays of cider donuts. Wept the way you weep when the story you've been telling yourself for years suddenly refuses to hold its shape any longer. You'll regret this, she said to me as the officer guided her toward the door, her voice thick with tears, but still, even now, edged with that old familiar bite. I'm your sister, Eleanor. Family doesn't do this to family. I let that sentence hang in the cold evening air for a long moment before I answered her, because I wanted to be certain my voice stayed exactly as steady as it had been all evening. Family doesn't drain their dying mother's savings account either, Carol, I said. Family doesn't forge a grieving widow's signature. You stopped being the kind of sister who gets to invoke that word a long time before I stopped letting you. She had nothing left to say to that. I watched the barn doors close behind her, and for the first time in 3 years, The silence that followed felt like something earned rather than something imposed. The days that followed the autumn preview moved with a strange, disorienting speed after 3 years of grinding, grief-thickened slowness. Detective Ruiz's investigation, bolstered by Priya's forensic report, Harold's document authentication, and Walt's sworn testimony, moved forward with the efficiency of a case that, as she'd promised, was about as clean as they came. Carol was charged with 2 counts of forgery, financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult regarding our mother's estate, and wire fraud connected to the shell company transfers. A stack of charges Renata assured me would almost certainly result in a plea agreement, given the strength of the paper trail, though the exact sentencing would take months to resolve through the courts. Grant Pierce, it turned out, had far more to lose than Carol did professionally, and within 2 weeks, his own law firm had opened an internal investigation that ended, quietly and without much public fanfare, in his disbarment proceeding being formally initiated by the State Bar Association. Preston Marsh, for his part, sent me a stiffly worded letter of apology on Larkspur Development letterhead, along with a check reimbursing the cost of the autumn preview catering, which I donated, every cent of it, to the county's Elder Financial Abuse Prevention Program that Detective Ruiz personally connected me with. It felt like the right use for money that had been meant to celebrate my own undoing. Sarah called me the morning after the autumn preview, having heard a garbled, second-hand version of events from a neighbor before I'd even had the chance to phone her myself, and I spent an hour on that call telling my daughter, gently but completely, everything I had spent 3 years learning about her aunt. She cried. Of course she cried. Nobody wants to learn that a woman they trusted with their mother's well-being had been quietly gutting that mother's legacy the entire time. But by the end of that call, Sarah said something I've held on to since. "Mom, I'm so sorry I wasn't close enough to see it, but I am so proud of you for the way you handled it once you did." That sentence did more to heal 3 years of quiet isolation than I can adequately put into words. Lily flew out that following summer, same as always, and on her very first evening back on the porch, shelling peas beside me in the golden early evening light, she looked up at me with the particular directness only a 13-year-old can manage, and said, "Grandma, Mom told me what Aunt Carol did. I'm really glad you figured it out." I told her that her grandfather had figured most of it out first, that he'd spent his last months on Earth building a shield for me I hadn't even known I was wearing until the moment I needed it. Lily thought about that for a while, the way she thinks about most things, slowly and completely. And then she said, "I think that's the nicest love story I've ever heard, actually, even though it's kind of sad, too. I think that might be the truest thing anyone has ever said about my marriage." Walt stayed on as foreman, of course, and I made him a full partner in the orchard's operation within the year, a decision that felt less like generosity and more like simple, overdue justice for 30 years of quiet loyalty that had finally been asked to speak up and hadn't hesitated for a second. We brought in the best harvest the orchard had seen in a decade that following September, and I stood at the roadside stand myself, the way Robert used to, selling bushels to families who had no idea what that particular crop of apples had survived to reach their table. I still go to the old barn sometimes, in the quiet hours before the harvest crews arrive, and I stand near that third support beam where a metal lockbox once waited 3 years for me to be ready to find it. I don't need anything else from that hiding place now. Everything it held has already done its work. But I go anyway, because it feels like the one place on this whole property where my husband and I still sit together in the quiet, the way we used to before any of this began. Before grief and greed and betrayal tried to take from me the one thing he'd spent his whole life building for both of us. I think about my sister more than I expected to in the months since, not with the raw fury I carried through that autumn preview evening, though I won't pretend that fury didn't feel justified for a good long while. Mostly now, I think about her with a kind of tired sadness, the sadness of loving someone your whole life and finally understanding that love was never going to be enough to change who they actually were underneath it. I visited her once, before the plea agreement was finalized, in the county holding facility where she was briefly detained. She did not apologize. She told me, instead, that I had always been the lucky one, married well, loved well, handed an orchard on a silver platter while she scraped by on her own. I did not argue with her. There was nothing left to argue about. Some people will rewrite the story of their own choices until their very last breath, and you cannot save someone from a truth they have decided not to see. What I can tell you, sitting here now, 3 years past the funeral and just over a year past that golden October evening in the barn, is that I am no longer the woman who apologizes for existing at her own kitchen table. I run this orchard. I sign my own name to my own decisions, and it is, every single time, unmistakably my own handwriting. No hesitation on the crossbar of the E. Nothing for anyone to forge or doubt or explain away on my behalf. My husband spent the last months of his life building me a door out of a trap he could see coming and I couldn't. But walking through that door, standing up in that barn full of string lights and strangers, saying the truth out loud without my voice shaking, that part was always going to have to be mine. If there is one thing I would ask you to carry away from this evening with me, it's this. The people who count on your silence are very rarely counting on your weakness alone. They are counting on your love, on your loyalty, on the very best parts of you, because those are so much easier to exploit than any weakness could ever be. Watch closely. Keep your own records, even quietly, even when nobody asks you to. And if someone you love ever tells you that you don't need to understand the details, you only need to sign where they show you. I want you to remember my sister's voice in that barn, and I want you to understand, all the way down in your bones, that you are allowed to ask to see every single page before you ever pick up the pen. Robert used to tell me that the strongest trees on this hill were never the ones that grew straight and easy. They were the ones that had survived an early storm, bent low enough to nearly break, and grown back anyway, thicker and steadier at the root for having been tested. I think about that every September when the harvest comes in, heavy and sweet on branches that have weathered 30 winters and one very long, very quiet war nobody outside this hill ever saw coming. I am still here. The orchard is still here. And somewhere, I have to believe, my husband is still watching those trees bloom every spring, satisfied, finally, that the woman he loved learned exactly how strong she always was. If you have ever had to protect something you love from someone who swore they loved it too, I want to hear about it. Tell me in the comments below where you're watching from tonight, and tell me what you had to survive to finally stand up straight again. And if this story meant something to you, if it reminded you even a little of your own quiet strength, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to this channel, because there are so many more stories like mine waiting to be told. And every single one of them deserves to be heard all the way to the end.